She stroked the painted stripes on his chest and shoulders, her fingers moving endlessly across his skin as if writing a message to him.
The paradox was that all of these disturbing possible dystopias were being conjured into being in between doing the actual school run and helping with actual homework. For, after the death of his wife, Ballard worked at the most unusual of his several careers, that of being a single parent and a homemaker.
Of course, in the mid-60s, when I found myself as a single parent with these young children, people were much less tolerant of the idea of fathers being single parents than they are now. It was very, very rare in those days for a man to bring up 3 children, and it was made absolutely clear to me by all kinds of people that I shouldn't really be doing it. That, people quite seriously told me, in no uncertain terms, that my children had suffered an immeasurable loss from the death of their mother, and no father could ever take the place. Of course, I didn't bring up my children, they really brought me up.
I think part of Daddy's writing is all about how normal everything looks, but actually under the surface, it's not at all normal. I remember him doing the odd strange thing. Like, I remember he sprayed his shoes silver paint one day, and then strolled around Shepperton, and Shepperton being a very kind of bourgeois, boring town, you know, all the local residents, you could imagine, were looking and thinking how weird. And when it was hot, I remember Daddy once stripping off and walking around the garden naked, which he thought was quite normal. But of course the neighbours all started looking and thinking, gosh, you know, who's that crazy guy next door? I remember one particular point, which was he obviously remembered the very, very bright light in Shanghai, because even on a really hot, beautiful summer day, he would have all the electric lights on in the house. And I sometimes used to say, we don't need the light on. He said, oh yes we do, it's got to be brighter.
Ballard's daughters, Faye and Bee, describing what it was like to be raised by the writer for Bookmark. It may be, given Ballard's own admission that it was the 3 children who really brought him up, that like many parents, they were actually rather unaware of what he got up to when they weren't looking.
I'm not a drug user myself. I once took LSD, which was a big mistake. I had a sort of classic bad trip, in fact. It was a kind of psychotic episode that made me feel that I literally, I think, was losing my mind for a day. LSD relies on tilting or damaging the sensory apparatus so that all colours begin to sort of separate. It's like you look at the world as if through a prism, you know, the colours of the spectrum beginning to float apart. Time slows down. The interiors of things like trees or settees begin to sort of migrate to their surfaces. My imagination works in a completely different way, so the LSD was really not the right drug for me. I think of my drug as probably alcohol, which has been a good friend, you know, to writers since time immemorial.
Ballard may have only taken one bad acid trip and disavowed the impact of it on his imagination, but it was difficult for his countercultural readers to believe this, especially when they sopped up passages like this one from myths of the near future.
Shepherd hesitated by the water's edge, and then stepped onto its hard surface. He felt the brittle corrugations under his feet as if he were walking across frosted glass. He'd almost ceased to breathe. Here, at the center of the space ground, he could feel time rapidly engorging itself. The infinite pasts and future of the forest had fused together. A jeweled snake hung from a bough, gathering to it all the embroidered skins it had once shed. Shepherd stepped ashore and walked up the slope. A giant butterfly spread its harlequin wings against the air, halted in mid-flight.
No wonder that as the 1970s progressed, increasing numbers of starry-eyed pilgrims made their way to Shepperton, expecting to find some magus in a psychedelic robe. Instead, they discovered a rather conventional-looking man, short-haired, sports-jacketed, who, while he may have later admitted to a very close friendship with alcohol, Ballard famously began drinking when he sat down at the typewriter in the morning, pouring himself a scotch every hour on the hour, nonetheless confined the vast majority of his aberrant behaviour to the page. He was the greatest English exemplar of Flaubert's dictum, that an artist should be a bourgeois in his life, a revolutionary in his dreams.
It was now 20 years since the earliest symptoms of the so-called space sickness had made their appearance. At first, touching only a small minority of the population, it took root like a lingering disease in the interstices of its victims' lives, in the slightest changes of habit and behaviour. Invariably, there was the same reluctance to go out of doors, the abandonment of job, family and friends. Almost without exception, the victims became convinced that they'd once been astronauts. Thousands of sufferers lay in their darkened hospital wards or in the seedy bedrooms of backstreet hotels, unaware of the world around them, but certain that they'd once travelled through space to Mars and Venus, walked beside Armstrong on the moon. All of them, in their last seconds of consciousness, became calm and serene, and murmured like drowsy passengers at the start of a new voyage, their journey home to the sun.
The American space program and that triumphant landing on the moon, a miracle of human courage, ingenuity and technology. The total failure to ignite the popular imagination is one of the great mysteries, I think, of the last, 30 or 40 years. It's extraordinary that this remarkable event, which must rate with Columbus's discovery of the Americas or Marco Polo's journey to China, has had no comparable effect on the human imagination. People were bored by it within, a very short time, within a year or two of the first landing.
How do you explain that?
Partly because science fiction got there first. I think it took the fun out of it. It took the mystery out of it.
Elaine smiled brightly at him from her anonymous cot, a white hand trying to draw him onto her pillow. "Roger, we're going away soon. We're leaving together." What Elaine and the other victims were trying to do was to explore space, using their illness as an extreme metaphor with which to construct a space vehicle. This space sickness was really about time, not space, like all the Apollo flights. We think of it as a kind of madness, but in fact it may be a contingency plan laid down millions of years ago, a real space program, a chance to escape into a world beyond time.
The revolutionary character of Ballard's dreams was evinced by his sheer productivity as much as anything else. 18 novels, 20 collections of shorter fiction, a volume of memoir, another of essays, 40 books in all. Other writers who blasted off into science fiction in the 1950s got lost out there, or ended up trapped in orbit around planets that were obvious simulacrums of Earth itself. But in setting his course for what he termed inner space, Ballard was able to slip under the English empiricist's early warning system and infiltrate the culture. He had snatched the body of a bourgeois, but really he was an alien and defiantly philosophic novelist.
I take for granted that eventually virtual reality systems will be available to us, which create a simulated reality that is more convincing than that which our central nervous systems create. I mean, one must remember that the brain is itself a virtual reality machine. The illusion we have of the real world, of factories and streets and office blocks and other people talking to us, is itself a virtual reality simulation generated by our brains. And I think when the first true virtual reality systems become available and contain more of visual information and are more visually convincing than ordinary reality, the temptation for the human race will be to enter this virtual reality system and close the door behind it. I mean, I think there's a danger there because one will really be able to enter into a fantasy world which, unlike all fantasies in the past, will be more convincing than everyday reality, beyond the sort of bounds of conventional morality altogether. I mean, one would be morally free to play with one's own psychopathology as a game. That's rather dangerous, putting it mildly.
I first encountered J G Ballard in East Finchley Library in the early 1970s. His were just some of the bright yellow Gallant's SF titles that I toted home to read by flashlight under my